Well, thanks for having me. I know I'm in a very dangerous spot here after lunch and 40 minutes because now everyone can be like warm and comfortable and I can just soothe them to sleep. But I promise I'll try and keep you as engaged as possible. So what I'll do is I'll spend probably 20-25 minutes talking to you a bit about what we do at Darktrace and how we approach cyber defense. And then I might do some questions at that point, or I might just dive into the actual interface and talk about how we can detect and respond in maybe a different way to the way that people tend to do it. So at the very outset, Darktrace uses unsupervised machine learning to detect in-progress cyber threats. And what I'll do is I will spend some time telling you a couple of stories, a couple of war stories with my customers, and where we've managed to articulate our message really well. And then, like I say, I'll go into a bit of a demonstration about what we do. But here's who we are. And I won't spend too long on this because this is all on the website. But ultimately, we are 5 years old. We were founded at the University of Cambridge in 2013 by a number of mathematicians. And then GCHQ and some of the teams there, the infrastructure teams, wanted to use the recursive Bayesian estimation that the maths guys are using to pioneer cyber defense. So today's topic is all about the change in the market and how we think we can best defend that changing threat by exploiting the opportunity to design and deploy self-learning, self-defending networks. So the crux of it is how can we understand the threat landscape and how can we then use AI to comprehend, recognize, and combat threats that are facing us. So I think Darktrace is probably most famous for finding one particular cyber threat in the media. We look after all of the, well, I'll say all, a few of the Las Vegas casinos. And the one we were famous for was someone trying to hack in through a fish tank. And the reason I mention that is just because A, it's hilarious, and B, it's very difficult to keep tabs on all the threat vectors that are very much alive in organizations. And the first story I want to tell is a manufacturing firm, actually a car manufacturer in Northern Europe. And whenever we work with a company, we spend the first 10 days with them, just letting them use the tech, and our analysts in Cambridge get very involved and they monitor and interpret the alerts that are being fizzed out. And during this initial learning period, which is always interesting because there are a lot of metrics that fly up that people aren't expecting, but one of the unexpected ones was this 100% mathematically rare connection out to Kazakhstan, and they were selling no cars in Kazakhstan. And what became very strange was that when we explored what the relationship was between IP destination and Northern Europe, was that there was no exfiltration, there was no theft of data being taken from the company. And the device that was beaconing out was actually a biometric fingerprint scanner that was used to protect all of their warehouses. Interestingly, when we looked into it, there was this huge upload of data systematically onto this scanner. And the reason I tell this story isn't because we found the threat, but it's more that it's comical that it's the first time we've seen a criminal upload their own fingerprints willingly onto a database. Now this one is perhaps more pertinent to what I want to talk about today, because I want to look at how can digital criminals start to exploit artificial intelligence. And we as a society have done a cost-benefit analysis, and we're happy to sprinkle cameras and microphones across our lives. There was a news story recently about a smart TV being hacked by the CIA over in the States. And they hacked in this smart TV so they could track a terrorist. And when you think about it, I mean, it's quite scary, but ultimately I don't really care if someone hacks into my TV at home. I mean, if they want to watch me watch Bake Off in my pajamas, then crack on, a bit weird, but you do that. But the thing that struck me was it was very easy to make the jump into what the problems then became in the enterprise. And any firm, especially one as sensitive as the data of the law firm, obviously uses their boardroom or meeting rooms as a haven for key discussions. So away from prying eyes, prying ears. And ironically, it was exactly the opposite to what we actually found when we had a look at this this customer's environment. So, like I said, there are IoT devices everywhere, in here as well, and the TV that was in the boardroom had a backdoor Trojan uploaded onto the device, and regardless of what the attacker was trying to do, whether it was to steal corporate information or take remote control access to the device and then launched a DDoS attack into another network, is largely irrelevant. But it's actually terrifying how easy it is to get inside the organizations that maybe not sat in this room, but are the ones that grace the front pages of the media. However, I don't think that criminals really came into their own profession to sit in boardrooms. I expect that, like most of us, they try and take shortcuts. They try and look for how can I make this as streamlined and as simple as possible. And when we start to explore how artificial intelligence might play a role in that, we can start to think about, okay, so I'm now inside this boardroom, I have access to very private, very sensitive information, and I can start to voice record all the conversations that are being said, and then I can go and scan that text. I can take it a step further and allow for a piece of software to scan that text for me, looking for keywords. I can then take it a step further and start to only record the information that I care about in terms of facial recognition. So only when the CEO walks in the room do I want to start recording. It becomes very, very quick and very easy for an attacker to get hold of information and then start to do as they wish with it. I went to a talk recently, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have been, to Codex. So those that haven't been, Codex is actually a really cool mini conference, really. And it's an amalgamation of people that are just trying to look at new tech. So you'll find NASA talk about space exploration. You have like people using blockchain for democracy. You have robotic hands trying to hold a flower. Really cool stuff. But there was a really good talk by one of the antivirus vendors, actually. And they were talking about the sophistication of the threat landscape. And they did a study from 2010 to 2017. And they looked at 3 metrics. And what they found was there was, between those 7 years, there was a 122% increase in cyber spend, so by companies to increase their cyber resilience, 272% increase in seed investments for cyber defense startups, people like ZoneFox and Darktrace, and yet a 309% increase in public cyber breaches. And what this really tells us is that it doesn't matter how you look at it, the trend line's going the wrong way. And this pie chart is interesting for me because what it tells me is that 96% of the threats, I think, are known. And the question then becomes, why are we not able to defend against them? Why are we still coming under problematic situations, even though 96% of the things are things we know about? And I guess that's really why Darktrace exists, and that's why I put this up, because Darktrace wants to look at the problem differently. The current problem for me and for us is this idea of predefinition, by pre-labeling good and bad things, by assigning rules and signatures in a way that means that we're always defensive. So malware attacks, we write code. Malware finds a way around it, we write code. We're always on the back foot by doing that. And when I move on to talk about the detail of what Darktrace actually does, it's worth bearing in mind the kinds of attacks that these are. So these are often silent or stealthy attacks. They are often very sophisticated hackers that are looking to seek for a profit, whether that's a political profit, whether that is a competitive fund seeking trade insights, whether that's insider threats like malicious employees, or insider threats that are non-malicious as well. There's a lot of that. So I think the point here is that the threat to data and to our systems is very much multifaceted and consistently evolving. I won't spend too much time talking about what a trusted attack is, but I think it's worth spending some time thinking about how can a criminal undermine what we do as an organization in whatever field you're in. So how can I undermine the company integrity would be one of the major things that a criminal would look to do. So we work a lot with healthcare providers. How can I start to undermine the work that the healthcare company has done, or how can I undermine the relationship between healthcare provider and customer? And there are some really simple, really obvious things you can think of doing, but also some really subtle ways that they can start to undermine and really can really poison that relationship between organization and customer. Things like changing a couple of blood samples, changing times of surgeries. So obviously this becomes far bigger than how strong are our systems. It's more lives are now at risk. And exactly the same situation can be applied to a bank as well. So if you imagine a subtle piece of code that just changes some bank accounts once a month, but obviously you have no idea which bank accounts have been changed, and it's often very subtle and very small, those changes and deviations. That really undermines that integrity, that trust. And we do a lot of work with oil and gas firms, and oil and gas firms, for some reason, believe they have loads of enemies. And one of their biggest worries is that a hacker will bring down one of their rigs. Obviously, that's catastrophic. However, I think if I was a hacker, I wouldn't look to do that because it's very noisy, it's very big. And when I want to undermine the integrity of a company, when I want to really do some financial, operational damage, I think what I'm looking to do is really maximize the longevity of the relationship. So this is a good example. So service customers process data for oil and gas firms, and there are hundreds of millions of data points in a seismic data set. And between 2 data points in a set might be 200 meters. All I have to really change as an attacker are a few of those hundreds of millions of data points so that I can really impact the longevity of the firm. So what I'm trying to do here is by changing just a tiny bit of data, I've undermined the relationship between the oil firm and the provider. I've also undermined all of the work that's gone in previously and all the investment that's gone in previously to get into this stage. And I've also undermined anything going forward between those two companies. And I've probably done enough financial damage for that oil and gas firm to pack up shop. You can start to see the enormous opportunity for cyber criminals that presents itself for not doing a lot. I don't want to spend any time on this. This is just a polymorphic attack that we found in India, and actually it's kind of irrelevant to the room, so I'll gloss over this. I think once we start to look at integrity, we can start to think about how can we start to look after our enterprises, our networks, our very IP in a way that is useful to us. And so I think that when we start to look at how can we make it really matter to the business, the key thing is understanding what we've got. So obviously we are in a time where we do business in all kinds of ways. We need to be cloud savvy. We need to bring your own devices set up. We need to be able to absorb SaaS applications. And obviously that's great. It presents a great opportunity for us to do business. But it also means that because of the size and complexity of the challenge, attackers can therefore become more sophisticated. Like we've mentioned, the speed of attack is changing. The stealth of attack, the patience of the attack is becoming far harder to predict what's coming next. And so what we have done at Darktrace is we have looked at the human body. And we've basically stolen the ideas of the immune system and put them into a business context. And this is really our approach. So our bodies are constantly under attack. We have to assume that. Our immune system assumes that. And of course, our skin protects us to a certain extent, but the immune system is essential for us to thrive. And there are a few things that we've, like I said, taken from the ideas of the immune system and thrown them into our product. The first of which is you have to expect threats. The second of which, you need to be able to evolve. So once you put a system in place, there's no point in that system being there and then 7 years later it's still being there, because 7 years is a long time. You can't rely on something that you've put in that long ago to still be up to date, really. In terms of the evolution stuff, we need to evolve in a way that as soon as we change, as soon as we come into contact with a new food or a new environment like a human does, the same thing is contextualized in a business. So as soon as there is a merger or an acquisition, as soon as we bring on new teams, as soon as we put in new pay structures, we can't immediately assume it's a problem, but we need to be very aware of the risk that that poses. And the third thing is immediate response. That's the third thing the human immune system does. So what we look to do, really, is look to help teams understand what this idea of self is within an organization. So Darktrace continually learns what is a part of me as my business and what is intrinsically not a part of me. And by expecting intrusion, it means that we can adapt and change and interact in a way that is useful to the business, but also can mitigate cyber risk as much as possible. This is the response side of stuff. So once we have identified mathematically there is a problem, how can we then mitigate that risk immediately? So to complete the analogy of the human immune system, once we've identified the threat and detected the problem, Darktrace produces antibodies to then bind or neutralize it. So in reality, what we want to do is quarantine that device until the team are ready to deal with it. And this is automation in a way that is meant to buy time for teams, not replace teams. And this is really the final strand in the self-defending part of the presentation. This inoculation of the threat, like I said, is designed to buy time. But what we're really doing is we're really allowing IT teams to understand what's normal, what's risk, and what needs to be spent time on. So like I said, ultimately, the threat vectors that we're seeing are rapidly changing. The stealth, the sophistication of attacks because of the new threat vectors that we're presenting have really changed. And so we feel it's vital for us to understand what is part of your organization, network, and what falls outside of that. The way we do that, obviously, is to have a comprehensive picture and a full visibility into what the network is. So what I was going to do, I'm going to dive into the demo, but I'm more than happy to take questions before I do that. I feel like it'll bring it to life more than a slide deck will.
Hi.
Hey.
Okay, hi. So we discussed a lot about the network.
Yeah.
The modern workforce is very agile, very mobile.
Sure.
They don't stay within a container, as we call it. So how does Darktrace deal with that? Because my strategy is towards consuming services. Users consume services. We deliver services, and they can be anywhere, and they should be able to operate anywhere.
I agree.
But I still need to protect my user base. So how would you work around that?
Sure. So, good question. I mean, the first thing to say is that Darktrace was designed in a way that sits at the core switch of a network and passively ingests all the raw traffic at that core switch, and therefore builds up this pattern of life for every user, credential, and thing on the network. Obviously, when people work from home, without VPNing in, you have no visibility of that. And I think, I know what we were trying to do at Darktrace was we were trying to protect the crown jewels. So the crown jewels in most of our customers were those critical servers which are on site on the whole. Sorry? Were. Yeah, so obviously my trip up is going to be when you say my CEO always works from home and doesn't VPN in. Great question. And
also nowadays it's not, with cloud, it's never in one place.
Yeah, sure. So I mean,
so your critical data is all over the place, and you build the application securely, but what we're looking at is making sure that the endpoints are secure and the connection and the vectors that's going on is valid.
So to be very clear, I mean, we have cloud connectors. We plug into all of the major clouds and all of the major SaaS providers as well that give you visibility into that. But like you say, we don't sit on the endpoint. So if your user goes to the cloud to use functionality, use applications, fine, we'll see that because we're sat on a server in the cloud, and that's fine. But obviously, when your user goes and sits in McDonald's, goes on the public Wi-Fi, and then goes straight to the customer site and has picked up a virus on that Wi-Fi, we in reality have no visibility of that. And I can't defend that because we're not an endpoint solution. Obviously, we will give you visibility into your cloud environment, we'll give you visibility into your whole network and everything SaaS related. But of course, there's going to be trip ups as soon as you, having said that, we look to partner and complement as many other solutions as possible. We don't really see ourselves as trying to compete with anybody, to be honest, because we complement antivirus, firewall, endpoint solutions. But we are very much protecting the network because, in reality, 90% of the stuff that matters to most organizations plays itself out on the network at the core switch.
The last statement I disagree with.
I thought you might.
That's fine.
Yeah, you talked about Darktrace quarantine the system when there's an issue. So the question is, the most common interest for the bad boys is the DNS servers and the firewall. So if there's an attack on the DNS server, does it mean this solution will quarantine the DNS server and then bring the whole network down, or firewall?
So what Darktrace is looking to do is, so just to be clear, we are looking to complement that firewall. So if you have an IPS or an IDS solution, then fine, that's okay. But yeah, so what we look to do is, mathematically, when that server deviates from its pattern of life, say 90% away from what it normally does, Darktrace will look to isolate the device to a degree where normal functionality can continue. So what we're not trying to do is we're not just trying to pull the plug on stuff. We want to stop the problematic part of the network. So perhaps a better example, just to illustrate my point, is a malicious user is leaving the company and wants to steal a pile of data that he's been or she's been working on. Now, Darktrace will recognize that that person has touched 3 servers at the same time they don't normally do. It will recognize that it's pulled down, had a number of SMB successes by pulling information to its laptop, and then has started to exfiltrate to Dropbox or something straight away. As soon as Darktrace sees there is a download and upload of data, it can then stop all outgoing traffic for 48 hours. So that's really what Darktrace is trying to do. I mean, if we start to try and block all traffic at a server, obviously that's going to have a much bigger impact on an organization than what we're trying to do. Because what we're really trying to do is really trying to stop things like ransomwares, where you have a user that downloads an executable file, sees a number of read and writes, Darktrace can then quarantine that device so that it no longer spreads.
So is it the user device or the server itself that will quarantine?
We will have a map of both of them, but it will be the user in this instance that is quarantined, because that's the problematic device.
Okay. So if the DNS server is attacked?
We would simply just start to quarantine that server, but to a point where, I mean, it depends what the attack is, because obviously if it's an outward-facing server, we won't start to quarantine that. So like a DDoS attack, we wouldn't quarantine that device because we would have to be mapping the network to have a pattern of life for that. It's only once it's on the network that we would start to have to quarantine it.
So it's only for internal attack, not for external attack?
So once external, yeah, basically. In theory, well, yeah.
Thanks.
No more questions? Let me see if my Wi-Fi works well enough to dive into this demo. How long do I have, by the way?
You've got about another 12, 13 minutes.
Plenty. So to be very clear, Darktrace is looking at all the metadata within a network. The way it's doing that is it's taking a span or a tap of a core switch, or core switches, whether virtual or in the cloud, or whatever it may be, and then displayed it in a master-slave approach here. So this is one of our European banking customers that we've anonymized. And the first thing you'll notice, obviously, is the color coding. The brighter the color, the more anomalous the behavior that sits within those subnets. And if you click onto anything, you get more information about it. So this is the 20 most active subnets in London. If you click onto any of these subnets, you get a picture of, or the relationship of desktops hopefully servers, one of these. Servers, and anything that resides within that subnet. Now, if we start to look into other subnets, we can see the relationship between subnet to subnet. We can also see the protocols that they're discussing over. We can also then go into any of these individual devices and play in real time what the device is doing. That's a particularly boring one. But if you were to search for anything in here, it would come up with what is that device doing in real time. So if we look at domain controller, for your example, we can see this domain controller in real time is connecting out to a demo server, a Linux 434 server, and then a number of endpoints over here as well. So what you really have is a comprehensive picture in real time of what that device is doing. Now, anything you see in yellow is going to be something which has fired an alert down the bottom here. If, by the way, you see a green cloud, which might be the case in some of these examples, that's when it's under anti-unit control. Just so you know, in terms of workflow, slide this up to minimize the threat tray that you're working with. But just for the point of the demo, I'll bring it back down. So most of our customers use either of these two views. What the bottom is telling me here is there has been an incident which has breached one of the models that Darktrace is looking at. And this is the unusual activity model. So any of these incidents have had a mathematical number put towards them. And this is how mathematically far away these users are from their normal pattern of life. So you can see this one at the bottom here, Sue Smith at Holdings Corp, has been 67% strange on Monday at 11:18. If I press the magnifying glass, we now go into the breach time. So we've gone back in time to the time of the breach. If I press play, we'll have the 30 seconds leading up to what this breach is. So immediately I've seen a number of failed SMB connections, fairly sequentially, all within the same second. We have the credential. We have anything in italics is Darktrace applying some kind of intelligence or some kind of knowledge to what's going on. So it's noticed, but there's been an increase in internal data accessed. Because we're collecting the metadata, we get the header of anything that this user has touched. So requirements and pricing document from 2014 may not be sensitive. If I pause it here, Darktrace has recognized that it is mathematically strained because of these three metrics. And what Darktrace is doing is it's applying 350 to 400 dimensions or metrics every second. And it builds up a very comprehensive picture of what that user is doing. That's basically how we build that pattern of life. It's a very rich version of NetFlow, basically. If I click on any of these, I then get a granular picture, a graphical picture, of exactly why it's breached. So this is the normal pattern of life, which is non-existent. So normally it doesn't connect to closed ports internally. But Darktrace has noticed that these three metrics, data transfer, internal connections to closed ports, and internal connected devices, those three things in tandem have meant that this is mathematically strange enough to then explore in detail. So again, this is internal connected devices. The normal pattern of life along the bottom here, and that huge spike clearly denotes why Darktrace was alerted. And you can do that for any of the metrics that we're mapping. I won't go into them, but if you were doing a forensic exercise, it's very simple to graphically pull out why the alert was fired. So this, just to put some context around it, I expect may have been this user in the middle here, probably clicked on a link in a phishing email and then had credentials taken and somebody tried to use their credentials to get into the system. Very basic example. But the reason I pull this up is A, because it demonstrates very quickly how Darktrace is working, but it also means that I can show you how we find pre-existing malware or pre-existing problems in a system. And this is basically done by clustering. So what we're doing is we're looking at devices that act in a similar way on a similar basis to the user. So Darktrace has brought together what are probably other members of the HR team that come online at the same kind of day, it's the same time of day, access similar documents, touch similar servers, and obviously that large spike there means that well, that's what we just investigated. Now, clearly, you could imagine that if this was spiking consistently, and you might assume that Darktrace learns that as bad behavior, this is how we get around that, because we can then see, actually, because comparing to other peers, there's no way that that's normal for that user. Just to dive into how most of our customers use this, so whether it's a one-man IT band or whether it's a fully blown 25-person SOC, this tends to be the main place they come to. Because what this has done is it's taken the threat tray from the bottom and put it on the left, and I immediately have a very comprehensive picture of why this is breached. So just to find the one that was a minute ago, we have 68% because of those three metrics. We have when it was first seen and last seen on the network. We also have one of the graphs that I just dug into, and then we can, if this isn't enough to satisfy us to discuss whether this warrants further investigation, we can investigate it or acknowledge it here, and that disappears. Just to go back to the original screen, I think what's probably the most obvious thing is the visibility. I think that when customers come to use Darktrace and they come to use it in a way that they're trying to investigate and trying to cover their own risk appetite, but actually there are most of the customers that come to deploy this are actually shocked by what their asset register gives them. So like I said at the very start, where they do that trial, typically this devices number when it comes up is 20-50% higher, often because people leave their Wi-Fi open, as I say often sometimes. But there are a lot of things which are they can pull out the system that are much softer. So when we start to talk about compliance things, a lot of my customers will give read-only access to some of their teams because it will pick up Tor usage, it will pick up privacy VPNs, it will pick up use of Dropbox if that's allowed or if it's not allowed. So although I don't want to boil the ocean, it's probably worth having a further conversation for anybody that wants to play with it, just to come and see me out in the room there. I'm conscious that I haven't got any time left, but...
you've got about another couple of minutes for questions if you want. Any questions?
Is there anything further than the
by that,
two we discussed?
So just to clarify then, if I sort of look at two problems, one,
Yeah.
is the network vulnerable and where are those vulnerabilities?
Yep.
And two, have I been hacked and is there something sitting in there? So are you addressing one or both of those?
I mean, arguably both. I don't like to put us down as like a network audit tool. It's not like a pen test. We're not looking to find things that are on fire in the network. I mean, it will. We've found some scary stuff. But typically what we're looking to do is find nascent stage attacks, because prevention is better than the cure, right? So what we want to do is we want to identify problems in their very early stages. So when we have, it's not a great example on here, but where we have very early indicators of somebody trying to get access onto the system, it's very easy to dismiss that. But by the time it's elevated 2 or 3 times, that should give our teams plenty of warning prior to the actual problem blowing up in their face. So to answer your question, I think that we are not looking at have you been hacked, it's more how can we help you identify where the risks in your business are, where the risks are in your business, and as a byproduct, you have this visibility into every asset you own. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so from what you're saying then, you are looking at from what you said there, that sounds like it's let's have a look at the network and see what the vulnerabilities are.
Yeah.
Which is where, so Veridon, for instance, is that a company that you... Veridon out of the US, or XM Cyber?
XM Cyber.
And are you sort of doing a similar thing to them, which is let's look at the vulnerabilities and then close those? Or a lot of my takeaway was that it's actually having a look in there and saying, where's the virus that's sitting, the attack that's sort of sitting there that's going to hit me at some stage, next week, next year, whatever. So, yeah.
We certainly do that. I think the premise of what I'm trying to say is that I want people to move away from this approach of we have to write a rule or signature for everything. Instead, we want to understand our assets well enough to say, what's a risk, I think. And the way we do that is ultimately by looking at what is normal. So yes, I mean, we do point you towards network vulnerabilities that might hit next week, next month, next year. But equally, I think it's the visibility and it's the granularity that you can gain from a system like this.